Welcome to today's webcast on becoming a better software architect. My name is İpek Özkaya and I will be your facilitator today. I'm a technical director at Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute, the SCI. My current work includes developing techniques for engineering AI, ML systems, and improving software evolution efficiency with an emphasis on software architecture, software economics, and managing technical debt. For more than 2 decades, Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute has been instrumental in creation and the development of the field of software architecture. We have previously done 2 webinars, What Makes a Good Software Architect in 2016 and What Makes a Good Software Architect edition 2019. In these webinars, we explored architects' challenges of working in an environment with rapidly evolving technology, role of the architect in agile environments, and how the range of skills and knowledges change. We know this can be daunting, and my favorite analogy comes from Gregor Hoffey. Gregor Hoffey describes an architect's roles and responsibilities as riding an elevator. He calls it the architect's elevator. Excuse me. And he suggests that a good architect should be able to ride the elevator of a high-rise, being able to get off at any level, either at the CEO level or at the developer level or at the plumbing sometimes. And that can be daunting for architects, and that's actually what we will explore today. I would like to introduce my colleagues who we've picked from a range of our skill sets from the team we have, and they're going to be bringing their different perspectives to the journeys that they've lived. Let me start with Keegan.
Hi everyone, my name is Keegan Williams. I've been at the SEI for the last 5 years. I am also working on a master's in the computer science field. Today I want to focus on a few points, the main one being that everyone on a team benefits from you becoming a better software architect. Improvements to yourself help your team members become a stronger, more cohesive group, and they help improve your designs on your projects and things like that. I also want to emphasize the importance of starting right now, learning how to be a better software architect. I think the sooner that you begin learning, the faster you're more of a help to your team. And finally, I want to emphasize that being a better architect results in you also just being a better software engineer. So coming from a more development-heavy background, and learning about software architecture and improving myself, I feel that I've become a stronger engineer in general.
Thanks, Keegan. And let's go to my next colleague, Phil Bianca.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the webinar today. And so I've been at the SEI for 15 years now, working in the architecture group, and I picked up a few things. And so we're here to talk about becoming a better architect. And one of the things I learned early was connecting with my stakeholders, and working with them and learning and making them part of the problem rather than, or not the problem, part of defining the problem rather than defining it on your own and then realizing later that you missed a lot of their pain points. And then we try at the SEI, when we talk about architecture in our group, we focus on what we call fundamentals and techniques. And so everything starts with business goals, things that are important to the organization, and then those lead you to quality attributes, and then quality attributes drive your design. And so from there, then we have a set of techniques that we use, and they're all based on a fundamental thing called the quality attribute scenario. And that helps you precisely define what you mean rather than talking vaguely about qualities. And then from there, you can find a bunch of different analysis techniques and design techniques to use, using those your scenarios as your key criteria. And so you have to remember that you can't have everything being important all the time. You have to have a set of drivers that you define. And then probably one other thing that's amazingly important is avoiding the opinion-based design. And so always have a set of criteria that's clear. And you don't want to go to a design review and be frustrated when someone hits you with performance when that's something that you have a pretty good handle on already. And you want to talk about security and interoperability. So staying focused on those drivers and getting people to focus on those drivers. And so becoming an architect is challenging. It's not something that I believe you can do just studying. You have to have experience as well. And so if you're young and you're picking a program or picking classes, I'd recommend looking for classes that have hands-on things that you can do on little toy problems so that you can learn how to architect. And then when you go back to work, you want to work with the architects. Don't sit in your cube. Don't wait for people to come and discover you. The architect's going to affect you in your development of the system, and so you want to ask intelligent questions and understand the architecture, start building that relationship, then you can start doing prototypes and things to answer questions for the architect, and then hopefully start being part of the design. And I was lucky when I started at the SEI, I had a lot of trouble with abstraction. I was a detail-oriented guy, and I found a good mentor. And so that was really helpful for me. And then the last thing, don't hide in your cube. Don't be afraid to show your work to people. That's the beauty of engineers and architects. When you work with them, you buy them a pizza and a few sodas, they'll come to a room and give you an hour of their time, and they will help you find the risk and the problems with what you're doing. So again, don't try to be perfect before you let things known, and look forward to the rest of the talk.
Thank you. And last but not least, James.
Hello, I'm James Ivers. I've been working in software architecture for about 25 years. I'm currently the lead of the SEI's software architecture group. My own journey's been a little bit eclectic. I've done a lot of research in software architecture. I've worked with a lot of large organizations and helping them with architecture challenges. And I've also been the architect in a startup environment. So that gives me a nice little breadth that I hope will add to today's conversation. But in preparing for today's talk, I had a couple of thoughts that I thought might be good to open with. First of all, I was thinking about, of all the architects I've worked with over the years, what are the characteristics that really set them apart as architects to be emulated or admired? And really the ability to maintain a kind of situational awareness is really important. The ability to step back and to know what's important to focus on at any point in time. Is this the right decision to be focusing on right now? Am I going into too much detail? Am I focusing on the right abstractions that will help the team make progress really quickly? These sorts of things really come down to getting past the basics of architecture, but really understanding the fundamentals, why things work the way they do, why good practices are effective. As Phil was saying, working with stakeholders is really, really important. And often the best architects I've worked with have an ability to translate between different concerns. Again, similar to what Ipek said with the elevator metaphor. A good architect can help management understand a really important technical decision and why it's important. It can help technical stakeholders understand why this matters to the business and the delivery cadence that they're trying to meet. And good architects can bounce back and forth and maintain consistency between all those stakeholders' interests and use the key abstractions to really make that happen. So these are some things that I've noticed in really, really effective architects. But as Phil said, you've got to practice. And building these skills, building this kind of judgment does take time. Some of this you will get naturally in the course of your job as you work on larger projects and you take on more responsibility and you make more design decisions. But there's lots of things that you can do to go along that effectively, in my mind, come to developing a questioning nature, a curious nature. Always reflecting on what you're doing. Why am I working on this right now? Is this the right thing? Should I be talking to other stakeholders whose voices haven't been heard? And these sorts of things can really help you seek out the kind of feedback that help you grow your own skill set and get feedback on the things that you've done and how well they've worked out.
Thank you all. And I think one of the common things that we're hearing that it takes time, it takes practice, and it takes patience. So my first question will be, what is something that you learned you wish you had learned earlier? I don't know, Keegan, you want to get us started again?
Sure. So I think one of the biggest things about being a software architect is just having communication. And that's something that I think I kind of learned maybe a little slowly because I grew up I started in more of a classroom environment. So I'm being told things, taught things, that sort of thing. But as soon as I got out into kind of working with other teams and other groups and working on a project, the early constant communication is just super critical. And I think that's really, really important.
You want to take next, Phil?
Sure. So one of the things I learned, and I would fall in love with my own designs a lot when I would do them, and when people would criticize them, I'd take it way too personally. And so one of the things I learned was to take a step back and realize they were challenging the design. And most of the people I've worked with over the years, they're genuine and they really want to help you. And so I learned not to take it personally and actually to think rather than trying to rule over them. There were a couple of times when I was a younger professional that I made mistakes. Luckily, they didn't kill us. But I did learn that sometimes people are right and they really have your best interest at heart in the organizations.
Yeah. James?
So in my case, it wasn't so much something I wish I'd learned earlier, but something that I wish I'd internalized earlier. So, I learned through formal education, good principles of architecture, the importance of stakeholders and going after goals. But I was once on a team where I was in an architecture role, gathering all the developers in the organization, small startup environment, and there was one particular technical issue where we were just butting heads day after day after day, and we were arguing back and forth. And at the time, it seemed so strange to me. I didn't understand what was going on because no one was saying anything wrong, and yet we're not making any progress. It occurred to me, a few weeks later, that what was really going on in that conversation is we were really disagreeing about what was important, what was the goals that we were trying to achieve, but we weren't making that explicit. And making that explicit really does help. And the textbooks say that, the lectures say that, but going through the consequences of not doing that and see the time that you waste. Because no one had anything ill intentions in mind. People were all making good faith arguments. They just weren't talking the same thing.
Yeah, that often happens a lot, and I actually had a similar experience when one of the courses that I was teaching, two individuals were arguing over flexibility. They meant completely different things, but they were trying to agree. They were both important. They didn't realize that they were naming it with the same quality attribute rather than the different ones. So we have actually a great question from the audience, and I'm going to take that next. What happens when you cannot start an architecture from scratch? This is a very good one. You want to go?
I'll take a start at that. I think that's pretty much the de facto these days, right? I mean, it happens for lots of reasons. Many of the organizations that we're working with are working with legacy systems, and they're trying to add features or improvements or do some sort of more radical modernization. And so part of what they have to do is to acknowledge the constraints of what they can change and what they can't. And there's usually a discovery process to figure out what is changeable and what is not. But even cases with new projects, you're still constrained. These days, we build so much on top of frameworks where so much of the architecture is already given to us. And it's not so much about making whole-scale design changes on a blank piece of paper. It's choosing an appropriate framework for our needs. It's configuring that framework for our needs. And that comes from understanding the context that we're in. And sometimes those constraints are technical. Sometimes they're just pragmatic. My organization has this skill set, so I don't want to retrain all my developers on a new technology. Sometimes it's regulatory. There are certain rules that we have to follow. And so architecture always works within constraints. And so one of the things that you can do is to really understand where those constraints come from and how hard are they.
Phil, you work with a lot of organizations that actually have to deal with their existing architectures. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, I mean, you have to start and figure out where you are. I mean, that's typically my first step. So I hope they have some documentation, but if they don't, I have to run tools on it. You have to run tools like Understand or Lattice to figure out what the key dependencies are and how things are broken down. I mean, you have to dig into the code a little bit. That's one of the important things is understanding. Okay, how are things statically allocated, and then you would run some tools on there, to figure out, okay, what are the challenges, and then you also have to find out, okay, where do they want to go, so to understand that, you have to kind of create, what is the map of qualities, what are they trying to achieve after you do all the reconstruction, which is really an art. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a labor-intensive activity, but when you get that, then you figure out, and then you also have to assess the organization. There are lots of times when I work with organizations and I realize, that they're not going to go for the big grand refactoring. You have to find things that are actually achievable based on their budgets, schedules, whatever they have going forward. And so you have to be realistic in your approach from getting to where they are to where they want to be. And that's often figuring out a set of migration steps.
So if I summarize both perspectives, I might say a better architect is able to actually find the information, dig in and see where they are and where they want to go and use some of the tools and techniques out there effectively. Right. Is that a fair summarization?
But if I could add something to that, because Phil brought up a lot of good points. Often an architect has an opportunity in a setting, right? So some things are hard constraints, some are just, they seem like they're constraints. And if an architect can dig in and make a good case that this is a better technical solution, maybe it's going to take a little bit to refactor it now, but if a good architect can connect that to here's the business value that you'll achieve by doing that, by connecting it to the concerns that other stakeholders have, not just the better technical solution, then that can have a lot of traction.
Mm-hmm.
So you both talked about kind of the discovery process a little bit. What happens if you don't initially find one of these constraints or requirements? Like how do you handle something new popping up in the middle of it? Is that just down to the framework that you're running, or like let's say, for example, you discover like a constraint that you need to bring into the architecture, but it happens 2 months into your architecture planning. How do you normally adapt to that kind of thing?
Well, hopefully when it's early in the life cycle, I mean, we're not talking about then migration. So, one of the things is if I found out, I'm hoping it's a technology family that I've already planned for. So if I'm told I need to use an Oracle relational database system, but I was planning on using something no SQL related piece of software or big data solution, then that's a much harder problem there. And so those constraints come, but you have to, again, like James said, you have to push back. Is this a real constraint for me, and why?
To some extent, I would treat it like a requirements change. And by that, I mean, requirements are going to change. No requirements document is static. And more organizations are getting smarter about doing architecture incrementally. So there's some awareness you have to build, the judgment I was talking about earlier. What are the critical decisions to make early? How do you identify those to all those stakeholders so that the foundation that you're laying, everyone knows the implications of getting this wrong, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you're not going to change it later, but you do your best in terms of raising awareness to your organization. Here's the consequences of these decisions, and I still think it's the right thing to do, but on the back end, things are going to change, right? You can predict some things with reasonable accuracy, but sometimes things will come at you that you weren't counting on, like the GDPR thing in Europe, right? Data privacy had all kinds of ripple effects through systems that no one was really planning for business value. But that's a good example of a constraint that came in later that was just not optional.
And Keegan, actually, your question is right aligned with some of the questions I'm seeing here popping up. How does Agile and architecture come together? How do you do evolutionary architecture? How do you actually dive into it? It's very similar. As James said, you have to plan for iterative and incremental process. And I think that's one of the mistakes that not so good architects make. Things will change. You have to assume for change and dive into it, whether you're starting with a greenfield architecture or you have to deal with the architecture that you have in hand. So there are lots of good questions coming in, and I can't keep up with that. But one of the things, so we'll figure out what to do with this, but we appreciate that. But I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about how organizations' career paths and the roles and responsibilities of the architect changes, because some organizations do have the architect career path, so you can go from a junior to a senior or to a lead. Others don't, but that doesn't mean architecture is not as important. So what is your advice for someone who might be working in an organization that does not have the career path but wants to develop the skills and responsibilities of an architect versus someone who might have that career path in an organization? Is there any differences? Are there any advice that we can offer based on all the different organizations that we work with? Phil, do you want to?
I would recommend if the organization isn't architecture savvy or they don't have the architecture practices in there, I would think you're going to have a high learning curve, and you would probably want to start a small pilot project that's probably not on the critical path. And I would recommend starting there and applying the techniques on that and showing value. And then you can move, and if you're successful, you can move to another project. And as you do a few of these pilot projects with the architecture work there, and it goes back to what I described earlier about the fundamentals and techniques, you want to rely probably more heavily on process when you're there and have a set of checklists that you go through and a set of ways to get the requirements, because that's one of the big problems I see in organizations when you go out there and they don't have the architecture practices. You have the quality attribute requirements just jammed in a spreadsheet with 1,200 other requirements, and I think you want to tease those out, make those first-class citizens, and then start showing that you can go downstream and start designing, applying patterns and tactics like I described on the previous slide, known solutions, using those also to choose technologies and things like that. And again, get away from opinion-based discussions. They waste time, as I described. And so that's how I would recommend starting.
Yeah, and I think Phil had echoed this in his opening statement, but for me, it's really just been about getting experience with small things. Like personally, I have a few personal side projects that I've used as kind of, maybe I'll just make all these quality attributes for this project, or like pick and choose with one or two things. Even if you can't get it within your own organization, just do it on things that you personally are interested in. And that helps you, A, pursue it because you're passionate about it, and B, helps you get the experience that maybe you can use either in your current job or even in your next job.
Yeah. And I've seen, well, like most things architectural, it depends a little bit on the context, right? So in a large organization with hundreds of staff on a team, there probably is someone who has an architect responsibility. And so getting to know that person, offering to review content, getting to side discussions can be one way to grow into that role. Smaller organizations can be a little more challenging. If you've got a team of 10 developers, there's no way architect is a designated role, most likely. But that doesn't mean that architectural issues aren't important. So things that you can do is when you're grooming the backlog, you can insert some architectural stories, right? This is an important decision that I think will affect the next few iterations. I think we should dedicate some time to it and offer to do that. Another interesting thing that I've seen practice occasionally, even in larger organizations, is it's a challenge sometimes when there's no designated role for architecture, there's no time set aside for documentation, which unfortunately we still see in organizations. But I recall one organization where there was a stealth grassroots effort at architecture. There's a team of engineers who got together at lunch a few times a week and said that the way we're doing this is crazy, we're working too hard, we need to design this in a more coherent way, and they did it on their own. And they built it up and kind of surprised management just how effective it was.
So I think what I'm hearing is you have to take ownership. You have to take ownership and responsibility, and I think if you're committed to it, whether there's a career path or not, you actually go about it. And I think because a good architecture is essential to a good product, you will definitely find support when you get there. So this next question actually is somewhat related and screams your name, James, because the question is how rigorous an architecture process should be in a startup environment, or what's the role of an architect in a startup environment? And I think that's similar to the organizational culture.
So startup environments are fun. So architecture in a lot of ways is about getting a team on the same page and buying down technical risk and buying down organizational risk. And all the core principles that we talk about in terms of understanding what's important play just as well in a startup environment. But the qualities that you are concerned about might actually be kind of different. Generating buzz might be a really interesting thing. And so architectural strategies that help you scale to broad publicity and things like that might make a difference. But in terms of how formal to be, that's interesting. One thing I learned from being in a startup is you've got to fit with the startup culture. If you want to force things to be too formal, you can ostracize yourself to some extent. You need to demonstrate value and get buy-in from your peers, not just your management. One thing that was actually kind of interesting in our environment is the architecture work that we did was actually pretty insightful to the venture capitalists who were funding us. They found that gave us technical credibility. We weren't just throwing out demos. We actually had a plan for how to grow the business. And so there can be that kind of insight. But I think in terms of how formal, as with any organization, you've got to be speaking the same language as your peers. You can't be doing UML when no one else in your team understands UML. You've got to find that common communication medium. And you've got to tackle the high priority issues so that you're not perceived as wasting anyone's time. You're demonstrating value and how this helps the company grow.
So I want to bring it back to the knowledge and skills, and maybe this might be something, Keegan, you might comment on as a recent graduate. We always get asked the question, can a recent graduate from a computer science department or something related call themselves an architect? So what does it take to get started as an architect? So what are your experiences and opinions on it?
Yeah, so I think that a recent college graduate can be considered an architect with the caveat of, as we've kind of been mentioning, experience is pretty important. So I personally think that given coursework, given the kind of personal experiences that you've had just even doing smaller projects or side projects, things like that, usually you're doing some form of architecture in them. You're not just going willy-nilly into development. But real experience, and I'll let James or Phil talk about this more, real experience in the field doing grounded practices is really, you can't go without it.
Yeah, so I maybe go a little more to the other extreme, is a little bit of skepticism for a fresh graduate calling him or herself an architect. I think Keegan's right. I mean, you absolutely get started, you can absolutely find these problems, start to build some skills. But one of the things that I look at as a hiring manager is how long have you been doing it? What's your real insight? And really important and harder to get as a student is what kind of feedback loops do you have? When I talk to architects, I typically want to know some interesting design challenges they've dealt with. And I want to know how they worked out a year later. And that's harder because that gives you the judgment, okay, this seemed like a good idea at the time, but did it really work out? Now, I know there are a lot of opportunities in things like open source community, big practicums that you can get in some graduate programs and undergraduate programs even. And I would encourage big exercises, right, where you have a team of more than a dozen people. And so your decisions have more impact than just on yourself, because that gets you feedback from other parties that can really help grow your skill set.
So we have an architect's elevator question.
Ah.
How should architects own products quality or test strategy?
So that's interesting. You look like you might have something to add, but I'll start maybe. So there are different, over the years there have been different papers and columns that say what is the role of the architect? Is the architect the dictator? Is the architect the mediator? Is the architect the coach? And I tend to favor that the notion that software engineering is a team sport and you've got to work together. So your architect should absolutely be talking to the people who are doing test strategy. Should your architect own that? I don't know. Maybe it's a more collaborative relationship. I'm not so hard over on that. In terms of product quality, again, I don't know about owning it, but the architect has to be well informed. They have to be talking to users or proxy users. They have to be talking to business stakeholders. And if you have a product owner who isn't the architect, that's great. They should talk to each other a lot.
Yeah, so I'd probably come down a little harder and say they shouldn't own it, but they should be working strongly with the testers and the people that own that. And my job as an architect is to find out, where they need observation and where they need control points. And that's one of the reasons why I like event-based systems. Everybody will tease me sometimes and say, every system you design is an event-based system. But that's one of the things I like about it, because you can optimize it and it's not really that much of a performance hit, but your control and observation points are right there for you. And it's very simple going forward. And so I don't think they should own it, but they should support it and work with them.
And maybe a piece of guidance we can offer is it comes back to the quality attributes, right? Testability is a key quality attribute that we actually enforce. And to the extent that they can emphasize some of the architectural attributes as quality attribute scenarios, then the architect could actually have an entry point in terms of how they can own and how they can collaborate with all the different stakeholders.
Right, and maybe just to build on that, for learning architecture, one of the things that you need to learn is the array of stakeholders across your organization and what they care about. And so just getting to know the test people, getting to know the people who do training for your product, getting to know these stakeholders and just chatting about what's important to them helps you understand the breadth of concerns that are really important to a system.
Okay, I'm smiling as I'm looking at the questions, but so Keegan, I'm going to put you on the spot and start with you on this question, and then I know Phil and James will have a lot to say as well, because you're re-architecting currently one of the projects that we're working on.
Yes.
And the question comes from Alex, who asks, please speak to the art of documenting in architecture.
Yeah, so obviously...
And we thank for the question.
So obviously documentation is a huge part of architecture. In the system we're currently building, for example, we've been walking through the team who's maybe not as involved through a lot of our decisions, and kind of we'll write them down kind of maybe informally in a document, walk them through, get some feedback, even just getting feedback from somebody who maybe doesn't have the same classical training, but being able to get, they're more on the development side. Getting the feedback from them on the development side is pretty important, because that helps you kind of align with them on what sort of what they're thinking on that. So having that first informal take, and then what we've been doing after that is going into a more formal form of the documentation, keeping it all up on a wiki. That way everyone on the team can still see it, and you can have revisions, all that sort of thing. Maybe that sort of answers the question. But
sort of, but I think I'd read on the question also, how does a good architect or better architect relate to the documenting of the software architecture as well? I know James is chuckling, but you get the last word. Phil, any comments?
Right,
as the author of the book, right? One of the authors of the books.
So obviously, we talk about stakeholders all the time. So you have to ask yourself, what am I documenting and why? So how does it allow me to communicate with people, and then what analysis does it allow me to do? So I think every architecture needs, runtime component connector views, the static uses and packages relationships there, and then also deployment. I think it needs deployment, and then I'm a big sequence diagram person because I think it really helps people understand what's going on in the system, and at different levels of abstraction I can run you through. You can understand. If I'm worried about performance, I can give time slices, and then after that, it's really dependent upon what you're trying to communicate and what you're trying to analyze. Now, I'm not a big formal notation person unless I have to translate it into some modeling in Sim. Otherwise, I like to use Visio, and I like to create my own key and produce things that everyone can understand, because as James said earlier, you use UML or SysML, a lot of people look at it and they don't really know what it means, even though those are standards that you use. And since James was an author of the book, I'll give him the last word, like he said.
Yeah, so documentation is I think more important than most organizations give it credit for or dedicate resources to. And the SEI had a big project, which everyone's alluding to. We spent about 3 years with a bunch of architects hashing out the essentials of documentation. And Phil rightly said, documentation is for communication and analysis. There are other purposes, but keeping that at the forefront of your mind is really important, because what the SEI certainly doesn't want to recommend, what I don't want to recommend, is producing binders full of documentation. You want to focus on the essential information to write down, not a whole lot more than that. You want to use means that are easy to update, easy to communicate with people. Your architecture or your documentation serves a purpose. It's not an end unto itself. And so that, working within that space, you document what you need to talk to people.
So a good architect definitely understands when to document,
Absolutely.
what to document, and
Absolutely.
who to document for, right?
And is careful not to get carried away.
Correct, and careful not to get carried away. So as we are speaking, some of our listeners are also chiming in, for example, in terms of being a good architect and the experience. The feedback from Selim says being software architect needs a real-life experience with big-size projects, minimum 10 years of experience. Another of our listeners say, well, this is really an experience-based, 5 years experience. So we're, I think, all on the same page. But I will connect this to one of the questions that we got several times. Mm-hmm. If it takes experience, but how do we really create accredited program? Are there certificate programs out there? What are some of the ways that people who want to become an architect can get some of these skills and knowledge in addition to their own efforts? We have one,
Yeah.
but do we want to, teach some of our courses, Phil. Do you want to get started with some of the education approaches, opportunities out there, and what might be other things that we can offer?
So, there obviously are master's programs out there, and again, like I described when I talked earlier, I prefer any program that's hands-on. And that's one of the things, not to plug one of our programs, but Carnegie Mellon has a hands-on where you do a project for a real company for 16 months. That to me was infinitely valuable when I was coming up, because I knew that it was a safe space for me to learn and try these things that I was learning in the textbooks going forward. And then we actually, when we tried to do, the certification, even just, we have our architecture trade-off analysis method. It was problematic when we were trying to certify people with that, because there was such a cost to doing it. It wasn't something, you had to have a real problem, as Salim had said online. It has to be a significantly large problem, so you have to observe them for a long period of time. I don't think that there's any tests, because everything is so context specific. I think that's why you don't see a lot of them, personally.
Yeah, so there's a growing body of literature out there in software architecture. Books, blogs, the webinar series like we're contributing to right now. The SEI has a few small case studies in addition to documentation and methods that you can apply. In terms of formal coursework, I think Phil's right. Application to real problems is important. But that pretty much requires you're in a team-based exercise, because again, if it's too small a problem, you're not really getting the magnitude of the problem necessarily. I think there's a combination of study and practice that just has to go hand in hand, whether it's through a training program, like the SEI does have some certificate programs that teach some fundamental skills, but by themselves, without practice and application and without more reading into the fundamentals, they're not going to get you all the way there. You have to do it.
Correct. And some organizations also have their own internal certificate
Yes.
programs in growing architects. But again, these are internal, and we can offline give some advice in those who are interested.
And I don't want to just keep beating the same point home over and over again, but just to beat the same point home over and over again, being in the middle of the program that Phil is talking about right now, where I'm in the middle of, or the first half of the final project for this program, it's really almost enlightening to be taking all the things that I've learned and then applying them hands-on. And I've always been a person that appreciates the hands-on thing, but just being able to kind of have that mentor aspect of, I have two certified mentors for my team, and we meet with them every week. We go over what we've done. Just getting that immediate feedback is critical.
Correct. So there's a question which I'm going to refer to our previous webinars, but I want to put it out there. Software architecture influences cost versus technical debt. Any tips on managing how this can be managed? In both of our previous webinars, we actually tackled this subject, so please go watch them, but if the question still exists, we will definitely answer that. So my next question is, how do you stay up to date? Because one of the challenges we have is technology changes very quickly. Technology drives some of the architectural decisions. Yesterday it was SOA, then microservices, today AI-enabled systems, tomorrow it will be something else. So any tips on that?
So one thing I would recommend is keep challenging yourself. Get out of your comfort zone. So for instance, if you're an organization that only builds real-time embedded systems, your day-to-day work experience is going to be focused on patterns, tactics, and architectures that support that environment. You could be missing useful insights from other systems. So you can go out and look for examples of published architectures. You can go find an open source system that's different than the kind of system you usually build and try and understand why they did things the way that they do. But to push yourself in terms of different domains is one way to push the architecture fundamentals. Another thing that you can do is to take a look at a design that you are working on and say, okay, this seems like the right design. If I change this requirement or this constraint, would it still work? Just keep pushing at those fundamentals. And I guess the other thing in terms of technologies, and maybe Phil, you want to tackle this more, but there is something to be said in terms of keeping up to date with new technologies. But as an architect, especially if you have a dedicated role of an architect, the level of detail that you need is maybe different than that of a developer. But I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what James said, and it was funny. I'll bring up a personal situation. A couple of years ago, James had brought me a project. I won't say the customer, don't worry. But it was a domain that I had never been involved in, and a bunch of technologies that I really didn't know. And I was really upset about it. I was like, I don't think I'm the right person for this. And he challenged me to get out of my comfort zone and get in there. And I realized with a lot of the fundamentals and techniques that I had already known and applied in other situations, yeah, it was intense. Yes, it was a lot of reading. And yes, there were days where I was like, this is the wrong job for me. But I did, get through there. And that's the idea, is to, as he said, stay out of your comfort zone, get involved in new technologies. And we have a concept when we do ATAMs, and we push people to come up with what we call exploratory scenarios. So this isn't anything that you would expect to be required today, but we would like you to run the architecture through it. So changing from, one technology or, AI and ML. Yeah. How would you integrate AI and ML into your system and look and see what kind of stress that puts on it and what goes on? And you can learn a lot about AI and ML, and maybe you're never going to use it. Maybe it's not right for your problem, but you could test your architecture, do those, because I'm hoping in any organization you have, at least you have some time for professional development to do those kind of what ifs. And if you don't, maybe you're in the wrong place.
And to plug in, ATAM is architecture trade-off analysis method that we use to review architectures. You can find all that information on our website. But James, you had another point.
Well, another thought that occurred to me is that there are community events, right? There are webinars like this. There are people who are explaining how a new technology that they're using was helpful for their system. Tune into those events, read those blog posts, and understand why what they did was appropriate in their environment and how it might apply or might not in your own environment. But again, just to keep looking for sort of new threads of information.
I also want to plug talking to your developers some more.
Yes. Great idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you might get, as an architect, you might start to, without doing a lot of your things yourself, you could get a big lead on what new technologies are out there, that sort of thing, just by talking to someone who's closer to the code. I think that most developers are usually knowledgeable about what's at the forefront, what's bleeding edge. And this is kind of another question I have for both of you, but in my opinion, it seems like you don't always want to be at the very forefront of the technology, as that has a lot of risk with it, right? You might have bad documentation or bugs or various other things that you wouldn't have in a more mature technology. So I'm kind of curious from you two where you think you should fall in terms of technology usage in a current system.
So my thoughts are it's an always and it's a depends. How critical is it? I mean, if it's the only thing, like say you're doing something new and bleeding edge, there may only be one or two technology choices there, so you don't have the luxury to pick other ones. But a lot of times, I try to stick to, technologies that are well proven, that have good support, that are well known if I can. And I don't want to use anything that obviously no one else is using. And so, yeah, it's that middle sweet spot that's really hard. But sometimes you have to use the bleeding edge, and that was the project that I alluded to with that James got me on the hook for. And so, you just have to make the best decisions you can. Try to isolate it, I guess. Yeah.
So you said something that I use a lot when I'm talking about architecture, reviewing architectures, which is it depends. And then, of course, what does it depend on? How can we give any guidance in terms of how to resolve that? It depends. The architecture 101.
I think that probably is one of the most common answers you'll get from an architect. Is this a good architecture? Well, it depends. What is the architecture supposed to do? What are your business goals? What does your deployment environment look like? And it depends comes up in so many contexts that any clarification depends on the context. Coming to a question that the SEI gets a lot, is this a good architecture for what I'm trying to do? There's a discovery process we have to go through to answer that. And good architects won't stop with it depends. I'll tell you what it depends on. It depends on your business goals. It depends on your timeline. It depends on what your starting point is and what your budget, your resources might be. Depends.
Yep.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, context is everything. And so it's kind of interesting because your experience is part of your context. And so you could assign James a design problem and give him the exact same requirements, and he's going to come up with a different design than I would. Mine will be better. No, I'm kidding. They'll both probably meet your needs, but they will be different in many ways. And so I think that's what people need to understand. That's why we think that there really is no cookbook. And a few years ago, I guess it's more than a few now, I'm getting old. But when we started working on a tool, which was the Architecture Expert, we realized in a hurry that we needed to have a design assistant, not an expert. And it still needed interaction with the architect because of all the context and things.
And one thing I might caution against that I've found myself doing in the past is falling into the same kind of technologies or footholds that you use on a different project just because you're comfortable with it. And that's something that James talked about, of getting outside of your comfort boundary so that you don't do that. And I think that's pretty important.
And also questioning yourself, okay, I used this last time and it made sense. Does it make sense to use it again? What assumptions might be different here? It's a good habit to get into.
So that's probably a very good segue to one of the other questions that we get. What are some of the common pitfalls, experienced or not, that you see architects falling into?
I think that is a great example of one. Just using, so when you get comfortable with something, you end up applying it to everything. So I find that is especially true with development and true with architecture as well. But one thing that I used to fall into as a developer was I use this language, I'm comfortable with it, boom, go do it. I mean, you'll find developers that are different. Some are I want to learn a new language with everything. And that's also an issue too, right? Because if you're trying to use something new every single time, it could not be right? It could be, so.
It depends.
It depends.
It depends.
It depends. One of the things that I've seen in a lot of new architects coming out of development, going into architecture is just this habit of chasing down every little detail and just getting into the technical weeds on every little question and not being able to step back and focus on the key issues that will help the other development teams get going. Because if your architect is using an architecture runway, they're trying to facilitate the advancement of the whole team towards a better solution than getting into a kind of a big upfront design and chasing down every little detail, because it's interesting and we're all problem solvers at heart. That's sort of the engineering mindset. And so that's a really easy trap to fall into.
Yep, that's true.
So I think my biggest pitfall I see working with external customers is this falling in love with reuse. Okay, reuse is important, but you have to remember there's a cost to generalize things. There's a cost to, and it's typically, I think the numbers I see is triple. And so you fall in love, and then everything is all of a sudden a common service or a microservice, and that may not apply because people look at that and they say, well, I can't use that general solution that you came up with. And if you don't reuse it at least 3 times, if it's triple the cost, then that makes it very difficult. So that's the pitfall I see.
And that comes back to what you said earlier about making data-informed decisions, not going with your gut, not going with what seems like the right thing to do.
Yeah. And if I may add, one I see often is assuming that the architecture will not change. Good architecture today will not be the good architecture a couple years from now. It will not be the architecture a decade from then. That's
if your system is successful, it's going to last another decade, and that means tons of requirements changes, deployment changes, technology. Yeah, absolutely.
And architecture is a living and it's an evolving artifact of the system, and not recognizing that gets you onto technical, that gets you to the cost, that gets you to all of the issues that you see down the line. So that's important.
Yeah, look at what the smart grid did to power companies. When that started coming out, they had common system plans that they had for 20, 30 years, and then the smart grid changed the way that they operate. And so that's something to be cognizant of, that things that aren't possible now will be possible in 10 or 20 years.
So good question. This is also related to the extent architects should do development and what other activities. How much should a software architect know about other close areas like software development, testing, and should they be concerned about keeping up to date with those areas as well? This again goes back to the daunting amount of skills and how actually you connect to those. So, any advice?
So I believe in the architect as part of a team, not the director from on high. And so understanding what your peers are dealing with and thinking of them as peers and getting their feedback, as Keegan was saying earlier, is really important. Understanding that there are certain things you can do in the architecture that makes it easier to inject tests, to inject sample data, to extract information on the health of the system over time. That's really good to know, and that's going to make those testers' lives a lot easier. But having that ongoing conversation is important. You maybe don't need to know the ins and outs of all the tools that they're using, but understanding their concerns and what things are costing them time and effort and just making it impossible to do their job, that's the insights you want to go after.
Yeah, you look at DevOps. I don't need to understand every nuts and bolts detail of every continuous integration server that's out there, but I do need to understand how I can help them, whether it's with deployment and having rolling deployment strategies or blue-green deployment, where we have 2 production servers that allow them to deploy things in a safe way that they can always roll back and things like that. I think that's important. So how can I help those people downstream? And so that's like the elevator. How much do I need to know about lingerie if I just want to buy it, or something in that department if I go down to
I think it also goes the other direction too, and I maybe alluded to this in my opening statement, but developers and testers should also know a little bit about architecture.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And if you can get, if you're a developer listening, you should learn, but if you can get them to take some time while you're also taking time to learn about what they're doing, I think it just helps with the whole team. It's a big team cohesion thing.
In it together, right? Common vocabulary, making each other's lives easier.
And it helps with your communication with them too, because you can start getting into some of the more formal tools and things like that.
You actually touch upon a very important point, Keegan. There's the software architecture career path, becoming an architect, and there's the architecture skill set that I think I agree any software engineer in the team should know, similar to any software engineer in the team should know a little bit of the testing, DevOps, or whatever is really relevant to that. Related to it, there's actually another interesting question, which goes to the large systems that we need to develop. There are other domain experts.
Yes.
And how do you bring those domain experts up to speed, systems engineers or other engineers that you'd rely on, but they may not appreciate software architecture or some of the aspects of the quality attributes or whatever that goes into that. Any experiences? Because we work with a lot of different domains as well. So that's...
Yeah, so one of the things that we did was we had, when we tried to do system ATAMs, which is the architecture trade-off analysis at a higher level with system, we realized that we needed a lot more from domain experts. You can not understand a lot about domain, but you can understand a lot about software patterns and technologies, and you can analyze things, but we needed them in there. I'm not an electrical engineer by trade. And so we developed, where we started training them to think architecturally, and we used scenarios at that level as well. And we're able to get their expertise in to look more in system and things like that. And a lot of times, I have a lot of trouble with the system architects because they'll only give me so many resources. And so finding that, I feel almost like probably the developers feel when I constrain them and try to empathize. And James sent me to consulting skills workshop a couple of years ago, and you started to learn, okay, you have to figure out what's important to the other people, and work with them in that way, I think.
Yeah, I think part of what made that work is starting with their concerns, the quality attributes. What is important to you? What are the issues that are difficult for you to manage? And how does that interrelate with the kinds of decisions I need to wrestle with?
So since we're putting James on the spot, and since he hires architect, the question is, but you've been interviewing as well. So
True.
if you're interviewing an architect, what are some of the questions that you
Yeah.
might ask? And there might be some of our listeners
Yeah.
who might actually be going after some of these positions.
This is true. So I care a lot about experience, and I care about insight beyond the basics, right? So there's generally a theme of questions that I go after, and I ask an architect candidate to tell me about an interesting design problem that they faced. I'm fishing for something where if I do it this way, I get this, but I lose that. If I do it that way, it's a different trade-off. But essentially, it's not an obvious decision.
Yeah.
I want to find those examples. I want to ask, how did you recognize you were in that position? How did you resolve that? And maybe most importantly, and something a lot of candidates don't do nearly as well, is how did that work out 6 months or a year later? What did you learn from that to change your practices? And essentially, I'm really trying to get to more than I know the styles, I know the typical architectures, but I know why. And I know how to reason about new constraints, new requirements, and adapt as I need to a particular context.
Yeah, and that's one of, I go not for particular questions, but more a style of interviewing. And I read an article probably 10 or 15 years ago, the first time our old director, Linda Northrup, had asked me to do an interview, and I was really nervous. And so I read an article and it said you should work on a problem with them. And rather than asking a particular question, don't give them a blank whiteboard and say, hey, design me this, but have a few design snippets up there and a few scenarios, and then say, hey, we have to change this design. Here are the problems I see with it, and then work through those problems with them. And because I truly believe I want to hire people rather than people that know something about one particular technology. I want to hire smart people that use rationale and make decisions and work collaboratively with others. And I think I can get a lot of insight that way. So I try to avoid one question, because I could ask them a question and they could completely bomb and get nervous. But doing that problem, but the article I remember said, do not give them a blank slate. Most people will panic when they're given. So if you do that type of thing, have a well thought out problem before you start.
And to add on to that, Phil, I mean, how often would you face a blank slate in real life?
Yeah,
right?
that's
Like,
right.
No.
It's
That's right.
You're always going to be working with something or using something that's already been there, that sort of thing. Like, it's hardly ever, list me out the pros and cons of this certain thing. It's usually like, we could use this, and you would just have to know the pros and cons, and you can kind of get that by working through a problem with somebody.
A candidate who can very technically and in detail can answer the question of it depends on how you go about that is probably good of. So this is probably a good point to put a shameless plug. Our team is actually hiring both in software architecture researchers and software architects. Go look at our website. And I have another very good question that comes from John Rees. He asks, as an architect, we often become a hub among many stakeholders across many projects, and the inflow of communication can be vast. What is your technique to manage that? If we manage this, right?
So the interesting part of that to me is across many projects, and there are a number of organizations that do this. They have a core architecture team that helps a number of projects to concentrate that skill set and make it available across lots of projects. In terms of managing the influx of things, hire more architects. That's the easy answer, right? I don't know. I don't know that architecture makes that problem any more or less difficult than any other problem of dealing with huge portions of incoming data. I mean, there are the obvious things. What's the essential? What's the noise? Are there some rules that I can generate to do this? Am I involving myself in more things than I need to? Are there more detailed discussions that I can actually step back from and just wait for the conclusion as opposed to being involved at every stage? It gets tough because anytime you give up something, you're giving up knowledge, right? If you have another way to acquire that knowledge, then you've got a good backstop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe you break down a system for a reason. And that's so you can divide it and give parts of it to other people to work on. Mm-hmm. And so maybe you try as an architect not to own all those team meetings there, but the results of what they're doing, and you give them a set of constraints and you give them a set of requirements for a particular piece of a system, and then you coordinate those pieces going together, and the integration points is what you would try to focus on. At least I would, especially if I was working across multiple systems, because that's the whole idea. And it's the same way when you go downstream. You use that same breakdown to divide it into teams and have people work together, and the integration points is where they come together.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that can be helpful is to use this as a mentoring opportunity to grow new architects. You find those talented developers who show a curiosity and an interest in this kind of domain, and you groom them to help out.
And those of you who might be familiar with our Software Engineering Institute architecture techniques, they're all stakeholder based. And we've heard over the years some of the organizations use them to actually balance that communication. When you have the quality attribute workshop that brings different stakeholders, you hear their perspective, and that can also provide a lot of good information to the architect to rely on going forward. So one question that's actually interesting, now we're going back to some of the things that we've already discussed, but Raul asks, why an architect being hands-on, what do you mean? Do you mean coding? What does hands-on architect really mean?
So I often don't get involved in the actual writing of code, but I do get involved in static analysis, going through the code, trying to figure out if it, doesn't have, certain code smells. And things like that, like code reused in many places. And I'll also do some peer review where I'll look over people's shoulders because I want to still understand the technology and be involved. I plan on working another 15 years, so I can't, stay away from code completely. And so I do that, but generally it's not a responsibility I have. I have so many other things that I'm already working on. But hands-on means you're doing those things and you're doing verification and you're really understanding what's going on.
I might have a different perspective just due to my day-to-day. I end up developing all the time. But that comes with the size of our team, the project size, that sort of thing. So I'm working on a smaller team where I'm actually expected to contribute code to these things while also leading architecture with other developers, that sort of thing. So on bigger projects, that's probably not going to apply, or even in bigger groups, anything like that. But on smaller teams, I think you might even be expected to know, or at least be able to break down line by line a piece of code, and just different perspective.
Depends on the scale.
Yeah, it depends on the scale.
So we're slowly coming to the end of our session. I saved this question as the last question, so take your time. What should someone who wants to be an architect know? What are your top 3 to 5 suggested topics that if they're getting new into this and they want to become a software architect, what is the knowledge that you would expect? What should they know?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's a hard one. I'll go with something that James and I had talked about the other day. And oftentimes when I go out on the web and I start looking for, patterns or design help, I often would struggle. And when you realize, I talked about patterns and tactics earlier, a lot of times when you look at different patterns, you'll see 10 different variants of MVC. And understanding and breaking those down in a way using tactics, which are smaller transformations, you can see that you have the MVC, and then maybe something like MVVM is, basically they're just decoupling things a little further and applying a couple of tactics. And so that can help you go a long way so you don't get scared when you look and see 10 or 15 patterns. I think that's a valuable skill.
Anything else you want to contribute?
I think knowing where to look for resources is a good one. Obviously, books is a huge one. Online lectures, things like that, from leading architects. Can't name a ton more, but I think just finding a good, solid resource for what you're doing and kind of diving deep on that really helps.
And I would suggest, for me, what might be the key is to stretch beyond the technical, to understand that architect is in the middle of not just technical concerns, but business concerns and project management concerns, and really getting to know how the context you're operating in, your users, your management, your timelines, your budget, all of these things, all of these constraints and forces that kind of shape the design, understand how they do shape the design, and how there's often not the best architecture, but it needs to accommodate that context. And really learning that by talking to more people in the organization, understanding why things happen, that can really help you with the fundamentals.
Yeah, and if I might add to those, I would probably also say someone who wants to be an architect should be comfortable with understanding quality attributes, quality attribute scenarios, and how they relate to the tactics and patterns and the technology, as well as where you bring those from different perspectives is one of the key skills that they should definitely develop. How to answer, to summarize some of our previous conversations, what it depends on and where do you find that. So that's probably also another aspect. So any last remarks that you want to leave our audience with in terms of how to become a better architect? Like we've probably, as a summary statement, And
Well, hopefully we haven't scared anyone away. While it can be daunting, there are a lot of things, it's also incredibly rewarding. So I would encourage you to keep at it.
And get started today. I mean,
Yep,
there's,
that's a
there's
good one.
plenty of resources around. Just look online, look at our books.
yeah.
And the earlier you start, the faster you'll be useful.
Yeah, it's collaboration and working with others. I mean, that's just an amazing skill. Making people feel ownership of what you're doing. It gets buy-in because inevitably you're going to have a situation where an important stakeholder is not going to get what they want. And so if everyone has a sense of ownership and they understand the perspectives of others, it can be much easier.
And that takes us to the end of the hour. I thank everyone who was online and who kept me busy here. I couldn't catch all the comments and questions, but we will definitely go back to them. And I hope it was worth your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.